Good morning, everybody. I will say just a few words to welcome you all to this workshop, actually to this entire day of discussions and reflections upon one of the main topics that has been discussed at the University of Trento during the last year. This is the final, so to say, session of a university strategic research project that has started last year. I'm sure that Professor Sciortino will say a few words about the project, so I will not say anything else. I just want to welcome you all and to thank you all for being here, and also to thank those who have spent the last year in this very, very important research project. But I say that mainly I think that we have to be aware that last year when we started this research project on migration, we were a little afraid that the effort that was going to be required was too much for our means. On the contrary, we had several meetings, we have several occasions to discuss different topics concerning migration, and I think that the outcome, which is going to be incorporated in a book, is going to witness our work. But we will go back to the issue of to the content of our meeting later on. I would like also to welcome and to thank very much Professor Maryellen Fullerton, who gave us the great pleasure of starting this workshop with one of the most authoritative scholar in the field of migration. She, as you know, has been here a couple of years ago as Fulbright professor, and we were so enthusiastic about her teaching and her great humanity that what was a professional relationship became a friendship. So when in June I was in New York and I invited Maryellen, she enthusiastically said that she was coming here, and we convinced immediately the dean of the Brooklyn Law School that we needed her for this day of work. So I really thank Maryellen for finding the time in her not formally very busy schedule. After here, she's going to Budapest and then go back for another meeting and then go back to New York. So I really thank for all of us, on behalf of all of us, Maryellen for being here. But before giving her the floor for the keynote speech of this meeting, I would like to invite Professor Sciortino, Giuseppe Sciortino, to say a few words about what we have done during the last year. Thank you, Giuseppe.
Thanks a lot, and welcome here in Trento. As you probably know, this initiative is part of this larger project, which is going on at the University of Trento, and it's a joint project of the Department of Law, of the Department of Humanities, and of the Department of Sociology, which, as you can imagine, are three very different tribes with three very different understanding of the words and three very different operational practices. So in some sense, we are a proof the integration is possible and that intercultural exchange is a very fruitful endeavor. let's say, we are studying this stuff, but we're also practicing it, which is pretty unusual. And I would say that collaboration between these three departments has been and is, because the project is still going on, and we hope it's just the beginning or much better and much larger things, has actually been one of the great experiences of the project itself. What I've been trying to do in these 2 years altogether has been basically looking at migration policy and migration law from two very different lenses. One, let's say, from above, from the point of view of law and policies, and we had a very long, some colleagues thought even a bit too long, series of seminars analyzing consistency and normative issues and practical issues, so basically any single field of migration policy and migration law. But at the same time, we've had somewhat something from the ground, collecting life histories of migrants, actually of women migrants, or women care workers migrants in Italy, because our dream, and we'll see if we succeed, but I'm optimistic, is basically to get something which is often missing, integrating the view from the ground, from the view from above some way, not looking only at policies and law as they are on the books, but also as they are in the life and through the lives of the people which somewhat are subjected to it. The collection of the fieldwork is finished. We are currently coding and preparing the database for use. And something which I would like to stress is that by designing the project, we decided that our data, the stuff we collected, will be public use a few months after the conclusions of the project. So for all of you, just to know that if you are looking for data on this kind of stuff, Trento will provide to you like to anybody else, because we think that research done with public money should be public. And of course, the more researchers work on the data, the more outcome the project will have. Before leaving the floor to Maryellen and Fullerton, which is of course the reason for which I guess you are here, not just for me or Giuseppe, just let me stress again that working with scholars of other disciplines is a very demanding but also very rewarding task, and the challenge to be able basically to, from one side, comply fully with professional standards in your own discipline, and on the other side, not close the eyes to what is happening to other disciplines, is actually a very good way of learning new questions and learning new knowledge in your own field. So besides, this conference is basically a graduate conference, if I remember well, more or less. Young scholar working. Well, the only stuff we can say we learned from this project is that it's not easy, but it's really rewarding. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody who's here today. I'm going to make a few introductory remarks from this chair, and then I'm going to stand up because as an American, I can't teach and lecture sitting down. So if you excuse that cultural oddity of my approach, I appreciate it. As you just heard, I had the great good fortune of spending a semester here in Trento on the law faculty in 2013. And it was a wonderful opportunity for me to learn from the ground up what teaching law was like in Italy, and especially in Trento, which has its own special institutions and ambiance. And I made many good friends, and also I was surrounded by such impressive scholars that have had, from then on, an impact on my work. I mean, sitting here on my left is the most prominent migration scholar in Italy, and it was so important for me to have the opportunity to read his work and to have different dimensions to think about as I looked at the legal system and the legal practices in the asylum law in the EU and in Italy in particular. And here on my right, one of the most prominent scholars on international criminal law, and the way these fields are intersecting. Just before I left New York, I saw a new article by Vincent Chatai about deportation as a crime of international law. And I thought, aha, our fields really are coming together. I confess I haven't read that article yet, but I will. And I think it'll be very fruitful as we look at the problems of migration, the opportunities of migration, and the challenges from multiple perspectives. Today I'd like to talk to you about a research project I'm involved in that I'm just at the beginning of, and it's about refugees who, of course, have left their home and are very unsettled, but then have the opportunity to be resettled in a new land, in a new region. And I want to talk about how the different models of integration and of resettlement seem to have, and that's what my research is about, an impact on the success of the integration of the refugees, their economic self-sufficiency, their mental health outcomes, and so on. So for me, this is I'm particularly looking at Canada and the United States, and I will describe this in a moment in a little greater detail, but it's a joint legal and sociological undertaking to try to get a better grasp on resettlement of refugees. But before I talk about that research, I want to talk a little bit about the painting that's on the, oops, let me see, the painting that's on the poster of our workshop for today, because when I saw it, I thought not only how beautiful it was, but how perfect it was. And I had just been to a lecture on art history in China, and they had talked about this very painting, which is known by the name of Auspicious Cranes. And it was painted by a Chinese emperor in 1100. And one of the things that's so wonderful about this Chinese emperor's painting is that he had not expected to be the emperor. He was the 11th son and thought there was no way he was ever going to come into power. So he devoted himself as a young man to calligraphy and to painting. And he developed this magical realism style. But then, sure enough, he became the emperor. And I was thinking how so many refugees, they never expect that their lives will be totally disrupted. Whether they'll become emperors or not is another question. But that it was such a, not only the visual image of the birds in flight, but the personal story of this emperor also resonated with the refugee and migration experience. This particular painting, apparently, the emperor did when a flock of cranes appeared around the imperial city on the 16th day of the first lunar month of the year 1112. And here we are in the 16th day of September of the year 2016. And a cloud of white cranes hovered around the castle, and two perched on the posts of the castle. And it's the two who perched on the post, who settled down, that I want to talk about, the resettlement of refugees. Now, in the United States, the resettlement of refugees is, in some ways, the most auspicious perspective, a situation individuals can be in. Because refugees who are resettled from camps overseas to come to the United States and to start a new life with government support and local support have already been determined to be refugees. So they've already gone through the process of showing that they fled persecution. And when they come to the new land, to the United States or Canada, and only a few do, like only two cranes landed here. Something like 150,000 refugees get resettled each year from camps abroad to new lands out of more than 15 million refugees, so it's a very, very small number. But in some ways, they are the most auspicious migrants because not only have they had the good fortune to be chosen, to have applied and been chosen, to have some support to try to put their lives back together, but the country that receives them already perceives them as worthy, perceives them as having truly had to flee. There's no question about whether they're economic migrants or are there false evidence they're putting forth. So they're welcomed in a very special way with their legitimacy and their vulnerability acknowledged right from the beginning. And that gives them, I think, a useful beginning to starting a new life in a new land. So, now, before I start talking, let me give a few definitions, a little terminology. So in my talk this morning, I'm going to use the word refugee in accordance with the international legal definition, which means people who are fleeing persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. Journalism tends to use that term much more broadly, and there are some exceptions in the United States and Canada in terms of broad use, but in general, I'm talking about that legal definition. And when I talk about resettlement of refugees, I'm talking about governments inviting people from overseas, from another land, and usually from another region, to come and become permanent residents in the new land. And this is very different from the asylum process or asylum seekers, which is what Europe is mostly familiar with, and of which there is a lot in the United States too. So the asylum process is a process that the receiving country establishes to determine which of those who come and say they're refugees really are refugees under the legal definition. So asylum seekers may or may not be refugees in the eyes of the law. They have not yet gone through a refugee determination procedure, and therefore the countries that are receiving them sometimes, frequently, view them with suspicion, don't know who's telling the truth about persecution and who's not. So the national response to asylum seekers, sometimes positive, as you know, is often negative. And I want to contrast those two situations. True refugees in both of them, but they, I think, are received by the new country in very different ways. And the new country, the resettlement country, has an ability with resettlement of refugees from overseas to plan in ahead who's going to come, how many are going to come, how the integration process will begin to work, which is a great advantage as compared to not knowing how many people may be in your country and may truly need protection, but you haven't predicted in advance. So the receiving country population often views the asylum process as chaotic and somewhat scary, whereas the resettlement of refugees is generally viewed as orderly, as helpful, as a very valuable and legitimate thing to do. Now, let me start a little bit, and let me stand up at this point, with, thank you, talking about the resettlement of refugees in the United States. It has a very long history, and of course we all know that traditions and history are often more important than what the law says. And the beginning of resettlement of refugees in the United States began right after World War II. And in particular, there was legislation passed to resettle refugees from Germany, Austria, Italy, and Czechoslovakia. in 1948. Clearly there were people who were displaced and had been displaced all over Europe and all over Asia during the Second World War, and the United States Congress felt very guilty about not having accepted Jewish refugees during and right before the Second World War, and in part in response to the sense of inaction in the 1930s and 40s. In 1948 passed this law welcoming and helping pay for the transport of refugees, displaced persons at that time as they were known, to the United States. And again, welcoming to a new life. The vision was they would become permanent residents of the United States, a country with a long immigration tradition. And that was then increased in 1953. And you can see here on the map that Greece and more of the Eastern European countries were included in this next set of legislation. And refugees, this is called I think the Refugee Relief Act. And there were something like 400,000 refugees that were resettled at that time. And then things kept whoops, what happened to my Hungary? My Hungarian map has gone away. Anyway, as you remember from history, there was a revolution in Hungary in 1956 that was brutally put down by the Soviet Union, and that led to many people coming as refugees throughout Europe, Western Europe, and the United States at that point resettled 30,000 refugees in the United States. Many went to Canada, and of course Austria took more than any of the other countries. The next historical big moment in the United States was Cuba. When Fidel Castro came to power, many Cubans left. And over the years, starting in really late 1959 and 1960 and up through the 70s, 700,000 Cubans came to the United States as refugees and were accepted as permanent residents of the new culture. And then there was the Vietnam debacle in the United States. And in Vietnam, that's where the debacle really was. But it resulted in 200,000 refugees being brought to the United States in 1975, and then that was increased in further later years to include Cambodian refugees and Laotian refugees. And then the Soviet Union, 380,000 refugees, mostly Jewish refugees, but also others, came to the United States as refugees in the 1980s. And one of the things, of course, you're noticing as I'm showing you these maps is, there was clearly an ideological aspect to all of this. And what was going on in each of these instances is that the United States president, often with the support of Congress, but really on his own, was responding to geopolitical crises and was responding in part by accepting refugees, and was doing that for political reasons as well as humanitarian reasons. And the result is that in the United States, there's this long tradition of receiving refugees and viewing them as people who are entitled to be in the United States, so long as the United States has chosen them from overseas. And then similar things happened in light of the Bosnian War. There was resettlement of refugees in the United States from Bosnia, from Myanmar or Burma. There have been about 100,000 Burmese resettled in the United States as refugees. Of course, Iraq, as we know, we're still living with the huge numbers of refugees from Iraq. This has been another major source of refugees in the United States. And to bring us up to today, Syria, where the United States has not yet accepted many refugees. 10,000 have come this year through this resettlement process. So I'm giving this history because I wanted to put a perspective on how refugees have been received, and also a bit on how the selection process has worked. It has been, overall, a very ad hoc process, a process responding to the political crisis of the day that has had some political salience in the United States. And a few decades ago, actually in 1980, essentially the United States Congress said, this doesn't make sense to always work in this spontaneous ad hoc way. It's fine to of course, have some spontaneity. We can't always predict what the humanitarian needs are. But we can predict that there will be humanitarian needs. There will be refugee needs. So in 1980, a new statute was passed that is helpful in looking at the world today from the U.S. perspective. And what I have, this map that I have on the screen right now, shows essentially in the pink the countries that have produced refugees to the United States in this historical era I've told you about. In the yellow, places where there are a lot of refugees currently who desperately need protection. And the countries in the green are the countries that have traditionally had programs that resettle refugees, that reach out to refugee camps, usually through the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and select refugees to come to those countries. And it's not surprising, but I think it's important to note that the traditional resettlement countries are countries that are traditionally view themselves as immigration countries. So they're the New World. There's Canada, there's the United States, and there's Australia. Now, you'll notice up in the top of Europe, in Scandinavia, Norway and Sweden also have a long tradition of being resettlement countries. And I just wanted to show you this chart of the 2014 resettlement numbers worldwide. Essentially, the three big resettlement countries take about 90,000 refugees. And then the rest of the resettlement countries, with Sweden and Norway and Finland leading the way, take smaller numbers. But I want to hasten to point out they're, of course, much smaller countries and, with smaller territories. But what we have here, then, is a refugee resettlement process that has grown up in immigration countries and countries that see themselves very much as welcoming people to come and live there permanently as opposed to temporarily. Now, you may know that the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees has a new campaign to increase resettlement responsibilities around the world, and it's working carefully and with a lot of energy to have a larger number of countries consider taking as a routine matter this resettlement process and inviting refugees to come to their country. So we'll see. And at the end of my talk today, I'm going to talk a little bit about new ventures in Germany and Ireland in particular. But my research that I wanted to tell you about focuses on comparing the United States and Canada, two countries that have similar refugee resettlement histories and refugee resettlement processes. And I want to talk first about the United States. What Congress said in 1980 was they said, Mr. President, it was only Mr. then, Mr. President, you can determine in advance, if you consult with us, how many refugees the United States should accept each year. So rather than this being totally a prerogative of the executive, this should be a joint project of the legislature and the executive, and it should be a steady project. We should think about it in advance, not just when crises flare up around the world. So each year now, the president, and this is President Obama's most recent one, sets forth a determination, sends it to Congress, Congress consults, and then when they agree on the numbers, and these are numbers that will have financial support, then the president publicizes how many refugees will be resettled that year. And this current year, 2016, President Obama said, let's make it 85,000. And not only is it 85,000, but within each region of the world, there's a prediction of how many refugees will be resettled, a goal, I should say. So you can see it's broken down into the Near East, which in this current year is getting the most refugees resettled. 10,000 of that 34,000 has been Syrians. And one of the reasons it's only 10,000 is the resettlement process in the United States, which I'll show you in just a moment, takes about 2 years of screening, particularly for people who come from countries like Syria, where there's concern about, in the population, about terrorism. So it's a long process. So there's a lag in terms of what refugees are resettled from what region. But you can see 25,000 have been selected this year to come from Africa to the United States as refugees resettled. And from East Asia, Europe, Latin America, a very small number. And then a few that aren't attributed to any region that are available for, in response to the needs of the time. So this presidential determination gets made every year. And at the beginning, it was made with much larger numbers in mind, because back in 1980, the Vietnam War was still a recent memory. The Vietnamese refugees and boat people were still a very big humanitarian concern. And the United States was determining each year they would take about 200,000 refugees and resettle them. The number has gone up and down. In more recent years, it's been about 70,000 per year. And it went up to 85,000 this year, specifically in response to the Syrian crisis. The plans is for it to go up to 100,000 next year, again with Syria in mind. Numbers, by the way, that I think are much, much too small. But nonetheless, that's what the numbers are in the United States right now. And I want to just pause for a moment and emphasize that in addition to the refugee resettlement process, there's also the asylum process. So last year, the United States, for example, had 57,000 asylum applications made by people who had gotten to the United States themselves, who had either come across the border from Mexico or had flown in, or who had come through Canada or had somehow arrived in the United States and then asked for asylum. And there are no limits on the number of asylum seekers or the number of asylum granted. So we have these two different processes going on at the same time. Now, just a moment on the refugee resettlement process. As I mentioned earlier, it sometimes takes up to 2 years. And most of those 2 years are spent in a refugee camp or in an informal situation where somebody has been registered as a refugee by the UNHCR and has been invited to apply for refugee resettlement, and then goes through a series of interviews in the, I'm just going to say camp, although it's not always camp, in the camp by voluntary agencies who work overseas with refugees. After that screening process occurs, then there's a screening process where U.S. officials of a refugee officer corps goes to the refugee camps and interviews people yet again. So these are people who've already been pre-interviewed and deemed acceptable, and decides whether they, in fact, satisfy the refugee definition of a well-founded fear of persecution. After that occurs, those who are successful at that level, then there are medical screenings, there are security screenings, there are fingerprints taken, and this internal screening process often takes as much as another year. So the refugees who are going to be resettled are a long time in the process and aren't sure whether the process is going to ultimately be successful. So it's a very daunting process. And ultimately, if they get through that whole process, then they are flown to the United States and greeted by agencies in the United States that will help resettle them. Now, the agencies in the United States, I want to talk about just a little bit and begin with Albert Einstein, because he is maybe the most famous refugee. And more importantly, for today's workshop, he founded an organization in the United States, or he was one of the founding members of the International Rescue Committee. And this is one of the 9 or 10 nonprofit organizations in the United States that contracts with the U.S. government to provide resettlement support to refugees. So people from the International Rescue Committee or the Catholic Bishops' Conference or Church World Services or whatever other organizations that have been approved by the United States will in fact meet among themselves, and I think about it a little bit like a card game, in that they're literally, these 9 organizations are sitting in the room together, or sometimes it's done by telephone conference, and they get the information. There are now 400 Syrians who have been cleared through the medical and other screenings who are ready to come, plus 5,000 people from Democratic Republic of Congo, plus 15 Laotians. Who's going to take them? And the organizations literally say very detailed analyses. Well, we could take 10 families of Laotians and help resettle them in Boise, Idaho, where there's already some Laotian refugees living. Or we could take in the Bronx in New York a few single men from Eritrea, and we have housing that we could help them get into. So it's a very detailed analysis before the refugees ever come, with a very careful, not always perfect, but a very careful selection as to how to maximize the well-being of the refugees in terms of how much it costs to live in that particular community. New York City doesn't get very many refugees resettled because it's so expensive to live in New York City, for example. So they tend to go to smaller cities across the United States, but very much focus on both the resources of the nonprofit organization, the local community's receptivity to refugees, and whether there are other networks from the home countries or the home regions that are available to help with the integration of refugees. So through that whole process, refugees transported by the IOM, the International Organization of Migration, come to the new land, where they are met by people who know their names, have chosen this particular family or these 5 families, and are there at the airport to welcome them and to take them to their new housing, which the local organization has already selected, has already worked with landlords. Now, the thing I want to point out, which shocked me as I started studying the process, is really, although there is a lot of logistical support, there's very little cash assistance provided to the refugees who are resettled. They always come to a place where the first month's rent and maybe the first 3 months' rent is paid, and there's food in the refrigerator. But there's not much more than that. So a big part of what the resettlement group does in the new town is it immediately takes the new refugees and enrolls them in all the social assistance programs that are available, so that the local country, the local economy will have the refugees enrolled in the welfare assistance, the medical assistance, the vocational training. And this is very key. The thought is that the sooner people get enmeshed in the local economy, the more likely they are to be able to get their feet under them and to become self-sufficient. And there's a very strong emphasis on self-sufficiency, which may be a synonym for not wanting to spend much money on refugee support. So, for example, a nonprofit organization might receive from the United States government for this family that I have on the board $900 per person in cash assistance to give to these refugees. But we'll provide all these other supports too. And of course there are abilities, if there are emergencies needed, to be able to advance some cash. But there's not a lot of cash that's given, and therefore the refugees, the refugee families in particular, need to quickly try to get their feet under them, quickly try to get employment, which, and as I want to say, because I think this is important, the moment they set foot in the United States, and this is true in Canada too, they are lawfully there. After 1 year, they are lawfully permanent residents of the country, with the idea, I mean, they have the choice to leave, but the idea they will never have to leave. So there's very much an immigration bias to it, a new world bias. There's no 2 years and then we'll renew it in 2 years and extend it again. And that's I think, another psychological as well as legal factor. So there's work authorization from the very first moment they arrive, as well as authorization to be part of the benefits programs. Now, this chart shows you, just in summary, how the numbers of refugees resettled through this program I've been describing since 1980 have varied. And you can see they were very, very high, up to 200,000 in the early 1980s, and then they've fluctuated significantly since that time. And this is something that can always fluctuate again. In contrast, the numbers in blue are the numbers of asylum seekers who've come to the United States each year for the past 10 years. These are much smaller numbers. The scale is not the same here. And they fluctuated some, but to not such a great extent. And as I mentioned earlier, these exist side by side. So in sum, as we pause at the end of my summary of the U.S. resettlement process, many, many more people, refugees, come to the United States through this overseas refugee resettlement process than come as asylum seekers. The ones who come through the overseas refugee resettlement process come with government support. Their transport to the United States is paid for. Their initial expenses in the United States are paid for. And the moment they set foot in the United States, they're lawfully present, entitled to work, and the presumption is they will get on with their life. In contrast, asylum seekers have no government support when they come to the United States. They come on their own. There's nothing like the reception conditions directive in the United States, which you have under EU asylum law. So people are really left on their own resources, either working informally, which is what many do, or landing in a community of people from your region who can somehow support you. And it's much more tenuous to come as an asylum seeker than as a refugee. So one of the things I'm interested in studying is what the long-term integration prospects are between people who come as asylum seekers and people who come as refugees. Now, for a moment, I want to go to the Canadian system. And Canada has a system that's in part similar to the United States, but it's got a very unique difference that I'm particularly interested in following up on. So there's a government-sponsored refugee resettlement program that's very similar. It's different in the details from what I've described in the United States, but it's generally the same. Then in addition, in Canada, there's private sponsorship that's allowed. So without going through the government, private individuals, either people who have long-term agreements, sponsorship agreement holders they're called, or community groups, or, get this, groups of 5. 5 individuals can come together and say to the Canadian government, we want to sponsor a refugee. And we have the money, we will guarantee that we will be able to support this refugee or this refugee family for 12 months. And we have a refugee resettlement plan. That plan will include showing how we are going to provide both financial and emotional and vocational support for the refugees who we are willing to take under our wing. So this has been going on in Canada since about 1980, so about the same time that the United States refugee resettlement program changed. And it's fluctuated, but it's been enormously successful. And the research that I'm involved in is looking at the long-term outcomes of refugees who've been privately sponsored as opposed to government-sponsored in terms of their long-term integration into Canadian society. Again, there's the notion that you have to individually welcome the refugee whose name you know ahead of time, whose family you've been able to, in part, pick. It's usually the UNHCR who identifies families most vulnerable and most in need of resettlement process. But within that group, the Canadian private sponsors can say, we want to take 5 Eritrean families, or 1 Eritrean family, or 1 Congolese family. And so there's very much this engagement of the private sector in Canada. And at least anecdotally, there appears to be not only better integration results from the refugees who are resettled and are welcomed in almost a family embrace. Come to Thanksgiving dinner at our house. You're our responsibility. We're glad to welcome you to Canada. But there's also a sense that there's a difference in the political attitudes and the refugee and immigration visions of the Canadian citizens who are doing the sponsoring. So that kind of dual look at the impact of this private sponsorship approach is kind of high on my research agenda. Now I'm going to leave you with a few statistics. The part of the graph that's in red is private sponsorship, and the part that's in green, gray is government sponsorship. So you can see it's varied significantly in Canada over the years. What it allows, this private sponsorship, it allows a country's people to respond immediately to a crisis that they feel connected to, either because of their ancestral ties or because just of their humanitarian response, without waiting for government and political changes to take place and government funding to be supported and provided. Now, there are some challenges here. There's a concern that if the governments allow and begin to rely on private sponsorship too much, that the government will stop thinking of it as a state responsibility to take care of refugees, to protect refugees. And that's an ongoing concern. Another concern is that to some extent, particularly when community groups are the sponsors, that it can almost seem like a family reunification program as opposed to a refugee in need program. Now, clearly those can overlap sometimes, but I think there are challenges here. It's not all positive in every bit of the implementation. But nonetheless, an extremely, I think, interesting method of responding to refugee needs, and one that I really want to follow up on. This chart, this is one of, I think, the last chart, shows that essentially, I think the numbers in red are the ones who are privately sponsored. So essentially, a quarter of the refugees who are resettled in Canada every year come through this private sponsorship. A little more than a quarter come through public sponsorship through the government. The other big section here are asylum seekers who on their own get to Canada and get refuge there. So again, a major portion of the Canadian resettlement process, one that I think is very important for us to study, and one that I hope we'll be able to implement in some ways in the United States. This is Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, who has made it his mission to resettle 30,000 refugees from Syria this year, and he seems to be accomplishing it, and who is very much a strong voice in favor of refugee resettlement. In closing, I want to mention that there are several efforts in the European Union right now dealing with private sponsorship. In Germany, 15 of the 16 states of the Länder have allowed private sponsors to work in terms of Syrian refugees. And Ireland has a similar program, and again, limited to Syria. Now, one of the ways in which they're both different from the Canadian and the U.S. and the Australian and the Swedish resettlement programs is that they're considered to be 2-year temporary residences, which need to be extended every 2 years, and they're limited to Syrians. And they seem to be limited to people who have a family member or a close relationship to Germany, to the states where this is allowed. I'm not saying those are negatives. I'm just saying those are differences in terms of the refugee processes and things we need to think about. But I find it very interesting as I start to do my work to see that other countries are also experimenting with this notion of bringing the private sector into refugee protection. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Maryellen. I'm really afraid that because of time constraint, we cannot have a Q&A session, but it would have been very, very interesting to continue the sense of your presentations, also to allow friends and students and scholars to elaborate a little bit on this very interesting research project, but we don't have time. I'm sure that something will emerge during the day, and if you will be so patient to wait and to stay with us for a while, I'm sure that there will be a follow-up to your very, very interesting presentation. So thank you very much.
I will be glad to talk in later sessions and informally if people have questions. So thank you for that opportunity.
Very good. Thank you very much. And I'm sure that one of the reasons why you came is exactly this, that you will have useful hints from informal discussions that will follow during the day. So thank you again. I think that at this point I have to ask Miss Veronica Manca to take the chair. And so this is what I do.